Hello and welcome to You Don't Play Boxing Mirror Fighting's Influencer Boxing podcast. My name is Martin Doman, joined by Donna Corby and Harry Davies for the final time in Manchester the morning after the night before. Tommy Fury beat KSI on points. We'll come to that more in a moment. It was announced as a split decision, or a majority decision, sorry. And Logan Paul beat Dillon Danis by disqualification after a brawl broke out in the sixth and final round. Let's get straight to it. We'll start with Logan Paul, Dillon Danis. Donna Corby, Dillon Danis did not train for this fight. True or false?
I'll be honest with you. With his ability, his boxing ability, it seems to me like he had the perfect game plan for how much boxing he can do. Which was
not to
keep
punch.
yourself hooked up and don't throw anything, and just make sure that you don't get hit clean. And then I guess his idea was that Logan is so big and Logan is so muscular and all this other stuff, and Logan will get tired if you just stand there and kind of let him wing these arm punches at you. And it was a good game plan for what his boxing ability is, but unfortunately he never did the second part of it, which is you have to go for it then at the end.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I haven't seen the punch stats. They were read out at one point. I think going into the fifth, either the fifth or the sixth round, I think he'd landed 9 punches. You can do that.
I heard maybe he landed. I think maybe he threw or landed 7 all night, something like that. But something like that. But if he had decided in the fifth or sixth to put the pressure on and go for it when Logan was tiring, maybe it would have been a great tactical display. But instead, shot for the takedown, and I thought a little premature from the security to jump into the ring when they did. When I watched it back, I thought it's not that bad. They're not really the referee can either disqualify him or not. It seemed a little bit premature on their side for them to jump in, but the security guards like being on camera and being a part of the story.
Oh, there's no doubt that. I think probably, to be honest, they were ready to do it, weren't they? From long before the fight, or before the fight started. I think yes, he shouldn't have shot for a takedown, but if that happened, and I guess that people were sort of maybe expecting him to do that, which is why people were on alert. But if that happens in any other fight, you're right. The fight stopped. He's disqualified, and we finish up properly. But they almost got in the ring, didn't they? When he tried it before, was it the fifth round? I think the security guards were halfway into the ring, so it was no surprise they actually did it when he actually went for it in the sixth round, and then just absolute carnage. The ring was filled with security guards, with Jake Paul with both teams, and ultimately, eventually, it was announced, I think, that Logan Paul had won the first 5 rounds, and ultimately Dillon Danis was disqualified. Did it almost save Logan Paul in that? Yes, he would have won the fight 6 rounds to nothing, but would it have been criticised for not finishing Dillon Danis had it not been overshadowed by what happened?
I think that it was not a great performance from Logan, and given the build-up, given everything they had talked about, if someone speaks the way Dillon spoke the entire build-up and on all these months, and then just stands there with his hands up and essentially says, "Go on, hit me," then you would think that someone would be a bit more aggressive than Logan was. You would think that he would be putting the pressure on and not letting Dillon breathe, but Logan definitely let him breathe. And if Dillon had made it to the final bell and lost the unanimous decision all 6 rounds, I think people would have seen it as some sort of a victory for him.
Is that basically? I mean, there was a lot of talk in the commentary during it, Harry, basically about that. It was that Dillon Danis knew he basically had very little chance of winning, despite what he'd said, and that if he could cling on to the end, and maybe do something, which I guess is what the takedown might have been, to sort of be able to use on social media afterwards to claim some sort of victory.
Sounds very familiar to some sort of tactics that Nate Diaz did with his fight with Jake Paul, but the difference was Nate actually sort of got the choke and got the good picture of him with his arms around his neck, whereas Danis sort of went for the takedown and ended up almost being hammer fisted in the face by Logan, which I know he apologized for doing in his post-fight interview. But yeah, I think that was the tactic. I sort of mentioned to Donna in about the second or third round. I was like, Dillon is definitely gonna pull something out in the sixth. There's no way he's just gonna sit with all these rounds not do anything and not have something up his sleeve. But yeah, it didn't really work in that final round. So I wasn't I know I sort of favoured Dillon to win by late stoppage, but given the nature of the fight in the beginning, I sort of thought something like that was going to happen in the last round. But yeah, the bad thing was for Dillon, it didn't actually work out. So I don't think he's really posted anything since the fight, so not his word on it. But yeah, would it be more embarrassing for Logan if that sort of brawl didn't happen and it was a lackluster sixth round, he just won on points? I don't know, but yeah, it's definitely embarrassing for Danis that you didn't manage to get a choke or a takedown at all on Logan. So
maybe we're the fools. Maybe everyone who bought into this fight are the fools. This is the problem, because it's not. Is anybody really surprised that we're sitting here on Sunday morning, having watched what we watched?
More so with the KSI and Tommy fight, when people were asking me, like my friends and stuff were messaging me, people who were at Cage Warriors in Dublin and that were saying like, "Oh, who won?" I said, "You," because you didn't watch it. It was it was just like the undercard was so great, and they had built it so well, and I think now that all is said and done, it was probably a very tactically sound decision on Mams and Calla's parts, Mams Taylor, Callis Ireland, to have such a stacked undercard so that they can kind of get away with the fact that the two main events, which were always kind of not going to be particularly enthralling contests, were tough to watch.
That's very diplomatic. Let's stick. We'll come to KSI Tommy Fury in a moment. Logan Paul, that was his first fight since he took on Floyd Mayweather a couple of years ago, and he had the two with KSI before that. I would assume he did call it Conor McGregor, but then I think everybody's called it Conor McGregor since these fights ended. But it seems fair. Would it be fair to say that he's more likely now to just go back to WWE and leave the boxing behind?
yeah, I'd say so. I mean, even though he won, I wouldn't say he looked very good. He was breathing pretty heavy come the third round. I know he obviously threw a lot of punches and sort of did tire himself out because he was going for the finish in one or two good sequences, but didn't get it. But yeah, he sort of joked in his post-fight interview that he actually won something. But I can't really see him sticking around, and I don't really know who'd fight after that performance. It was pretty unconvincing, to be fair. So I think a return to the WWE is something that makes more sense for him. And obviously our name's there, like you called out Conor. I don't really see that happening. But yeah, who else? There will be opponents, but I don't really feel like it's logical to make it because he didn't really look very good. So yeah, maybe the WWE is a safe spot for now.
Off to SmackDown to face Rey Mysterio next. Another great size matchup for Logan, just like the Floyd fight.
And what next with Dillon Danis?
Back to MMA, I guess, and his hands looked a lot better than they have done in his MMA fights. He clearly did. Like you asked at the start, did he train? Yeah, he probably trained a little bit because he looked better. He was getting clipped in those early fights against the journeyman in Bellator, and really he was defending himself a whole lot better this time around. So yeah, I think maybe go back to MMA. He could still do stuff in Bellator, PFL. They could get him matchups and finagle things in a way where he could be a big star, and he's certainly a lot more famous now than he was 2 or 3 months ago. So he's got more options in the fight game than I think people think.
Moving on to KSI Tommy Fury. Tommy Fury announced as the majority decision winner, one judge apparently scoring the fight a draw. It's since emerged that he can't add up. I mean, surely someone should be checking this as well, I don't know. But ultimately, he had actually scored the fight 57-56 to Fury, the same as the other two, so it should have been a unanimous decision. KSI claimed a robbery. Tommy Fury was deducted a point in the second round, I think, for punching to the back of the head. It definitely wasn't a robbery. I think you've made that clear on social media, Donna. And really, again, I mean, how do you reflect on the fight? Did Tommy Fury looked terrible, which we've sort of come to expect, but even for him, didn't look very good. KSI just did a lot of hugging, really.
Yeah, I think it's funny that that everyone will clown on like Anthony Taylor on the undercard and then think, "Oh, KSI was robbed." It's like he did the exact same thing, and he clearly. When I said that he was there to survive, that's maybe not the right terminology, but he definitely was not. As the fight grew on, he definitely didn't fancy a firefight with Tommy, and he definitely was tiring, and he was trying as hard as he could to get in close. And I'd imagine that was probably the tactic from the team. But no, it's definitely not a robbery when a fight is that sloppy and that slow paced. And you're right, Tommy looking not very good at all. And I think if I were Jake watching that in the crowd or watching that in the backstage, I'd be going, get me that rematch right now. I think I can beat this fella. And I would be, calling everyone in Saudi Arabia and saying, let's do it. Let's make this fight happen. So yeah, I thought no robbery. Mams came up to me afterwards and I was speaking to him and he was like, what did you think? Because everyone's saying it's a robbery. And I said, I think the only person who was robbed was Tommy of a bigger decision win, because they also didn't even give JJ a warning for all this holding. He didn't even get told, if you do it again, you'll get a point taken off. They just never punished him at all for destroying the fight as an engaging sort of a contest. And yeah, I think not the best night for either of them.
Harry, how did you see it at ringside?
Yeah, I think it was pretty clear that Tommy won, but I did worry with the point deduction. I said to Donna, this is why I think KSI wanted 6 rounds, because he gets two rounds under his belt, and all of a sudden, people are saying, it could be swayed to KSI's favor. So, I did think that was going to happen with the point deduction. But looking online after, there was the scorecards were sort of all over the place, and some people like KSI that were in like 4 rounds, and I actually had to say, I'm like, I don't remember. Of course, Tommy didn't either, really, because of that was mostly because KSI was clinching. But I don't really remember KSI landing, any really clean punches. However, it was also very hard for us to see from ringside, because with about 2 or 3 fights breaking out in the crowd, there was security all stood up, so we could not see a single thing other than their bald heads. So we were forced to just watch it on the screen. But yeah, it was so it just really didn't live up to the hype at all, and disappointing. But like Donna said, I feel like, as harsh as it may sound, KSI is the one to blame, because every exchange was just a clinch and a clinch and a clinch, and he sort of had a different take on that in his post-fight interview and said he was slipping rather than clinching. I think a lot of people would disagree with that. I didn't see really many slips from him, but yeah, I think it was pretty clear cut. I'm guessing, correct me if my maths is wrong, obviously you can see I'm very tired, but for those to have it a draw, you needed to give KSI 2 rounds, given the point deduction. And I think a round at best, if I'm being nice to him, was what he got. So yeah, I had it for Fury, and I'm glad that common sense did prevail.
I'm seeing people say like, oh well, you could maybe argue that he got it 3-3 and then the point deduction, and you could argue that it's 4-2, Tommy, all this stuff. But at the same time, it's all you could argue this, you could argue that. At the end of the day, he didn't do enough. He came in with all this bluster about throwing stuff. Like, they talk about his power. Didn't look at, like, he landed a couple of clean ones on Tommy, just like Jake did. And Jake was supposedly had this great power as well. And I thought Tommy handled everything that was thrown pretty well. And just not what we were hoping for. And of course, then it's all, well, I'm a YouTuber and he's a boxer. And I also thought it was funny that when Jake Paul said a couple of months ago, if he ever fights in the UK, which would be against KSI, it would have to be under the British Boxing Board of Control. Everyone said, oh, he's making excuses. Oh, he's ducking. Oh, this is a chance to get away from the KSI fight. Well, maybe it would have been wise to fight under the British Boxing Board of Control. It's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit harder to get around. But a lot of that stuff would have been avoided, and they probably would have had better judging than the PBA. Also, the PBA is like, it only works on KSI fights really these days. So the idea that they would be biased against KSI seems strange to me.
Yeah, I think ultimately, as I said, I think I said the other day, like you change your opinion or you build up your expectations of a fight based on what happens in the build up, and you start to believe things that are just not true. And ultimately, KSI performed exactly, probably, as he should have performed, and exactly as you would expect him to perform based on what he'd done in his previous fights against far weaker opposition. So I suppose we shouldn't really be sitting here being too surprised, but we'll come on to it in a minute and about what these two fights really say about the scene in general, because my Twitter was full of opinions from real boxing people, so to speak. But before we do that, Tommy Fury sort of initially seemed to allude afterwards that he was done with influencer boxing, which would be really daft because he's not going to ever win anything in professional boxing and this is how he's made his money. Then seemed to backtrack and simply said he was done with all the trash talking, etc., etc. Jake Paul seems to be, I mean, KSI will want a rematch, I'm sure. You know, if he's got the choice of the two, does he go back to Jake Paul?
I think if he's, I mean, he definitely should do the rematch with Jake. You're 100% right. He's not going to be winning anything in the professional ranks, unless maybe, possibly, it just was impossible to get going against someone this unorthodox, and he actually is good. But geez, he's had 10 chances now to show us that he's good on TV, and between the three big ones, the three big fights where he's in front of a big crowd, Anthony Taylor, Jake Paul, KSI, he has not performed to the level he would need to in any of those fights. And I would think that, yeah, the Jake rematch makes a bit of sense. I was never enthused by this matchup. It was never a particularly exciting matchup that I was like, oh gosh, I really want to see what happens with Tommy Fury and KSI. I always kind of expected the result to go in Tommy's favor, whereas there is a bit of intrigue to Tommy and Jake. There is a bit more of a story there. This story was obviously a little bit forced because it looks like Jake has no interest in doing this fight with KSI, and they were trying to bring this storyline to some sort of a conclusion. But no, I think the rematch makes a lot of sense for Tommy and Jake. I would imagine, I would hazard a guess that it's not going to sell as many pay-per-views if KSI and Tommy decide to go once more.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that Jake's rematch clause with Tommy Fury doesn't have any sort of expiry or deadline.
Well, I did ask some sources about that a couple of weeks ago when they were talking about what Jake was going to do next, and I said, is it such a way, because they were talking about if Tommy didn't want to do it, and different situations in which Tommy wouldn't want to do it. And I said, legally, is he still, despite the fact you've both fought since, legally, is he still obliged to do this rematch should Jake decide? And I was told, yes, he is. So I guess if I were Jake, I would be on the phone immediately saying, let's get this booked for the start of next year. And Jake's team very tactically chose the date for the first one. With obviously it happened right around the time that Molly May was due, and I would imagine if I were them, they should try to get it done by the end of January, start of February again, because Tommy obviously will probably enjoy his Christmas now, his first Christmas as this big boxing star. Also, it's funny that Tommy is probably going to be the main event of two of the biggest stars, two of the biggest pay-per-view events of the year. What a star Tommy Fury is. So yeah, I think if I were Jake, I'd be pushing hard for end of January, start of February rematch in Saudi again.
I think Harry's fallen asleep. He's just disappeared. If we wanted to, and I'm not suggesting that we do, if we wanted to bring an end to influencer boxing, Harry, what we would do is just have Jake Paul KSI fight and then finish up, right? That's what should happen.
I apologise for leaving, as I had room service telling me to get out of my room, and I did tell them that I'm pretty sure 12 was a checkout. Otherwise, we would have had to wrap this up early. But yes, I feel like that, and I want to see that fight next. They both. I know Jake's got back in the win column since losing to KSI, but they both lost to KSI now. I know Mams was saying they were trying to make that fight after Jake lost, to Tommy, but now I feel like it's the right time. Maybe at the start early of next year, but it just seems silly not to go with it. And like you said, if you do want to put an end to this, that is the sort of fight to make. And maybe for that reason they don't. Maybe they just push this out as long as they can and make as much money before they decide to do this fight. But that's the one I want to see next. Neither. I feel like from my opinion, Tommy won both those fights, pretty obviously. So why not do it next? I know KSI might want to do what Jake did and get a win under his belt, maybe against a very old and washed up MMA fighter, but I want to see it next. I think it makes sense.
Also, I've said this a million times on a million different platforms. Jake and KSI can lose 50 more times, and people will still want to see that particular fight. And I think that's always like a thing that Jake has in the bank. Is like, okay, I'll try this, I'll do this, and I guess if none of that works out, no matter what, I can still fight KSI, and it'll still be a huge event. And certainly after last night, despite everything, there will be a massive audience for Jake and KSI.
Does it ever happen?
I would like it to, but
we know that.
I think if I'm 100% honest, it doesn't seem to me as though Jake is particularly interested in it. I think he's pretty happy with what he's building in the boxing world, and I think he might try to now start going the standard boxing route and fighting journeymen on undercards and stuff like that. So, and making less money, but trying to take the sport a bit more seriously. Not that he hasn't taken it seriously already, but yeah, I would be surprised if it actually came to be.
Let's finish we should address the fact that there is a lot of, and there always has been a lot of outcry about influencer boxing, its place in the sport, its place on a broadcaster like DAZN. Last night, if you look at the card as a whole, I think 11 fights, I want to say. I would suggest that 2 of them were reasonable. Dean the Great's win, not a surprise that he looks good, he has done in the past. And then Slim's win over Salt Pappy were the 2 fights that I would say passed as technically proficient. Otherwise, which makes 9 fights, I think, we can't really include the tag team actually, which was a lot of fun. I'll be honest, you just got to take that separately and you just can't even think about that as being boxing. But it was a lot of fun. Clearly there is an issue with the quality of fights, but do you give any merit to those people who are quite furious about the fact that influencer boxing is taking such centre stage in a sport which is very different, professional boxing, very different to what we saw last night?
If they didn't want to watch it, it wouldn't be happening. There's a massive audience. The AO Arena in Manchester was jointed last night. I know that Dan Aziz and Joshua Buatsi is probably going to be just as big, so it won't be an issue in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I feel the same as Donna. The people complain about this, and then you have promoters like Eddie Hearn who is literally sat ringside thinking, God, I wish we could do this for a show of the scale Donna just mentioned. So it's still very new and fresh. So the old sort of boxing heads are always going to complain, but when you sell out an arena last night, and like I was saying to Don, it was pretty full from early on. It wasn't like people were just coming in for the Logan fight. It was packed up pretty early. So I feel like it's every old school boxing promoter's dream to have an arena like that. And obviously a lot of people are jealous of the fact that influencer boxing can pull these sort of crowds. So yeah, I'm happy that it's sticking around for now, and I hope it does for the foreseeable future.
I tend to agree because so if you're in London any week of the year, you can go and watch white collar boxing, and it's probably of a similar standard. I mean, some of it's worse, some of it's better, but there are some fights that are just the same as what we watched last night. The difference being, obviously, the fighters last night have a huge following and people know who they are and people want to watch them fight. So if the fights are going to happen, and you can't stop people fighting, you can't stop people playing five-a-side football, you can't stop people playing, Sunday league football or village cricket or whatever. The fights are going to happen. Somebody will put them on, arenas will host them, and a broadcaster will put it on. So I don't really understand what people want to happen, because you can't go to DAZN and say, morally you shouldn't show this. Like you can't really ask us, morally you shouldn't be covering that. Well, I mean, I could go to my boss and say, actually, I don't want to cover this anymore because it's not right and shouldn't be happening. And he'll turn around and say, okay, well, find me something that does as much, that brings the eyeballs just as much as influencer boxing does, and we'll stop doing it. If someone at DAZN says to their boss, all right, we'll stop doing it, he'll say, okay, fine, bring me something that brings the viewers the subscriptions that influencer boxing does, and we'll stop doing it. I don't understand what people want to happen. It's not going away.
No, and look, it'll go away like you say. When there's less interest in it, it'll go away, and there's less interest in some of these cards. So, eventually, KSI won't want to box anymore. Jake won't want to box anymore, and if there's not big enough stars to do it, then the big shows won't happen as much. And I just think, like, you don't have to watch it. You don't have to if you don't enjoy it. It's just a different kind of entertainment. There are people who won't watch MMA, but it's still going to be on there. People who won't watch kickboxing. And kickboxing is a good example. People might have disliked that back in the day when it was big. And then eventually the stars died out, and it obviously still exists. And obviously they have huge stars like Andrew Tate. But they don't have... it will filter out. And this thing will eventually peter out if there isn't the interest in it. But for right now, I think people need to get over it.
I think one of the arguments also is that, and I think at the start, I remember when Eddie Hearn did KSI Logan Paul and put it as the main event on a professional boxing card with Billy Joe Saunders defending the world title in a dreadful fight, actually. But his point then was, this will bring, and all the fighters trotted it out as well, I'm happy to fight on the undercard of KSI Logan Paul because it'll bring new eyeballs to the sport, blah, blah, blah. I think everybody has accepted in the fight of the 4 years since that just doesn't happen. It's a different audience. But I think the argument is still being put forward that that's the justification for doing these fights. But it's, as I say, it's just a different audience. It's not. No, I don't think anyone in influencer boxing cares if people go and watch Joshua Buatsi next weekend.
Yeah, it's two different things entirely, and I feel like it's going to take a while for people to accept that. But when they do, it we'll maybe stop having this conversation about whether it exists, because you can't put the two in the same category. And for all the reasons that you and Donna both said, don't know how long it will take for people to realize that. But like Donna said too, if there's no stars, this doesn't happen. So sort of a case of enjoy it whilst it's around. I know last night the two top fights didn't really live up to it in terms of technical and ability, but you can look back and say it was a crazy event. For maybe the hype and the fight build up was a lot more exciting than the fights. But when you sell out an arena last night and the atmosphere is what it is, it's it's a great thing regardless of how the fights are.
Very, very finally, sorry Harry, let's just touch briefly on the undercard. Who impressed you most and why?
Harry?
Has to be Ed Matthews knocking out Swarms. I know. I don't even think he believed it, because there was sort of a few looping shots, and even I said to Don, I don't even know what he knocked him out with because I didn't see it. But 17-second knockout. I go backstage to try and interview Ed Matthews. Bear in mind it's a lot of talking points. He's knocked out Swarms quicker than KSI could, quicker than Deji could, and there's a lot of table in there for knockout. But he was more interested in, skipping all the post-fight media and going wherever he wanted to parties, because he did none of it. So yeah, I'd say Ed Matthews. Obviously, there are a few other good ones in there too, but that's the one that stood out the most for me. Slim
handled business very well, I thought. He weathered the storm from Salt Pappy, who is a big, powerful puncher, and obviously, it was a bigger lad and has dropped a bit of weight. And I thought that was a really entertaining fight, and I thought Slim did very well. Tag teams were crazy. It's funny that Pineda, who's the journeyman boxer, looked probably the worst of them all. And I think that with the tag teams, we were saying the thing, because you're tagging in and out, if there's not a limit to the tags, there shouldn't be rounds. It should be a continuous, because you're getting the break. It's not like you're getting time off. And I do love the pacing of it, because you can go all out until the gas tank's gone. That could be 30 seconds. That could be 45 seconds. And you can have an explosive fight and then go, I don't fancy it for a bit. I'm going to jump out for a second. And I thought it was entertaining, if not a little bit crazy. But, and of course, as always, the one who impressed me most, the Misfits Light Heavyweight World Champion, Anthony Pretty Boy Taylor.
That's what I meant to say at the start. I can't. Okay, I can. Listen, I don't mind influencer boxing. Obviously, I'm sitting here. We covered it last night in depth. But the moment that Astrid Wet was introduced as a world champion, I think I just about cried. I understand wanting to have belts and titles, and if you want to have a Misfits title, that's fine. They can't be introducing these fighters as world champions. Surely, even you agree with that?
Yes, of course. Come on. Although I do think that once Fury and Usyk, once they unify the belts, they do need to unify, unfortunately, with Tempo Arts as well. But no, I think that, yeah, world champion. I mean, it is very funny. And Anthony was kind of playing into that a little bit. He was like, I'm the first guy who won an MMA title and a Misfits title. He won like a local regional title in LA in MMA, and then he won the Misfits belt. But no, the world title is quite a thing to call them. And look, Astrid Wet is a world champion. All these other people, Slim, I think, is a world champion as well. But it also actually, it's not worth getting into now because we're towards the end, but it also is actually, I believe, against the Ali Act for the promotion to be the ones creating the world titles, right?
That's a good point.
But it doesn't really matter because these fights are MF Pro. They're not pro, right?
Of course. We shall leave it on that. Misfits is back in November, I believe, with Jarvis headlining at York Hall. I'm sure there'll be some complaints about them daring to go to the home of boxing in the UK. But we'll be back then, but we'll be back much sooner. Tyson Fury against Francis Ngannou, which we are, as we said, way back when we started this podcast. We're claiming it on You Don't Play Boxing because it's very much a crossover fight. So we'll be back very soon with all the latest on that and, of course, the fight itself. Until then, do take care and thanks for tuning in.